All right, go ahead and if you have your Bible this morning, turn to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 13. 1 Samuel, chapter 13. Let me see if I can get this. All right, 1 Samuel 13. And we'll pray real quick before we start reading. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this day that you've created for us. Thank you for your love for us that you show every day. Thank you for the little things you allow us to enjoy. Just enjoying your creation, enjoying fellowship with other believers, enjoying your love for us every day as you just shower upon us blessings that we don't deserve. Lord, I'm thankful for your love. I'm thankful for the salvation that you've given me. Thankful for everything you've done for me. I pray that that would be at the forefront of all of our minds this Sunday as we spend some time worshiping you, spend some time singing praises to you. I pray that your goodness and your gentleness would be at the forefront of our minds. Lord, thank you for the gift of music. Thank you for being able to sing praises to you. Lord, you're worthy of it. I pray that it was a pleasant sound to you this morning, hearing our hearts sing to you. Lord, I pray that you'd give me the words to speak this morning as I'm preaching. I pray that you would guide my thoughts, help me not to talk too quickly or too slow. Help me to just be a vessel that you can shine through. Pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so 1 Samuel chapter 13. I'm going to be preaching this morning about trusting God and about faith. So I'm going to be looking at this passage here and kind of comparing Saul as a king and what he did here in chapter 13 and comparing and contrasting that with David, who will come along later. So let's go ahead and start reading in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. It says, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of his people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah. And the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastwards towards Bethaven. So I want you to kind of build in your mind a little bit of background of what has transpired so far in the history of Israel and in the history of Saul's kingdom. This is his second year of reigning now. 1 year has passed. He's now coming into the second year, and these events are transpiring in his second year of reigning over Israel. In his first year, if you remember having read in the book of 1 Samuel before, the people of Israel, after having been ruled by judges, having been ruled by prophets, they said, give us a king. We want a king to rule over us so we can be like the nations. We want a king that we can serve and that will follow this king. And that, of course, wasn't God's initial plan for the people of Israel. That wasn't God's ideal. That wasn't his direction. That wasn't what he wanted for his people. So the nation of Israel, still they press through and they say, Lord, we want a king. They're talking to Samuel, who's God's prophet. They say, we want a king to rule over us. We want a king so that we can be like the nation, so we can have a ruler. And the people of Israel, not God, but the people of Israel select Saul to be their king. And if you go back through the chapters, you can see the reasons they gave. You can see Samuel's response to them. Long story short, Saul becomes the king of Israel. And I believe it's the chapter before where Saul leads the nation of Israel against the Philistines when the Philistines capture the city of Jabesh Gilead. And now we're coming into chapter 13. He's still a young man. He's probably in his young to mid-20s. Young king, just been made the king, still in a relatively unsettled place, and he receives this trial of these Philistines now are gathering themselves together. They're bringing their armies together. They have 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, men that can't even be numbered. And even more than that, the Philistines themselves just were way outmatched to the nation of Israel in terms of militaristic strength. You can read towards the end of chapter 13 if you want to look at a couple of verses. It talks about the Philistines having smiths and the Israelites not even having smiths and not even having swords or spears for their soldiers. And just from an earthly perspective of this, conflict that you're seeing here, the nation of Israel was just so far out of their league in this conflict. From an earthly perspective, they would have had no chance at even no chance at even comparing with the military might of the Philistines here. But something that's always important to remember, I think I preached here, was it maybe 3 months ago, and preaching about in Judges the Israelites fighting the nations of the land. But the fact that God had always promised the Israelites victory in battle if they would surrender themselves to him, if they would yield themselves to God, he had already provided a provision for the Israelites to win. Joshua chapter 23, verse 8, it says, "But cleave unto the Lord your God, as ye have done unto this day, for the Lord hath driven out from before you great nations and strong. But as for you, no man hath been able to stand before you unto this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he hath promised you. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, that ye love the Lord your God." This is just one verse out of the many, many different verses throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. These books where God is bringing the Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land. Time and time again, God promised the nation of Israel, "I'll fight for you. I'll fight your battles for you." The nation of Israel, if they would submit themselves to God, he said, "I'll be your strength. I'll be your guardian. I'll fight for you. I'll be your strength and your buckler." You read through the Psalms where the kings and the psalm writers would write about their God and write about the stories of God, knocking down the walls of Jericho, God driving out the inhabitants of the land. There was never a time in any of the books of history about the nation of Israel where they came to a battle that they lost because of a militaristic defeat. It was never about the size of their army. It was never about the technology of their weapons. It was never about the strength of their hands, the strength of their arms. It was always a spiritual component. It was always whether or not they were yielded to God, whether or not they were serving God, and that would determine the battle. Even the next chapter after this is chapter 14. It talks about Jonathan and his armor bearer going up and fighting a garrison. And Jonathan says, "There's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." And he has this mindset of understanding that his God, these battles that they'd fought, these battles that the Israelites had fought, never hinged upon Jonathan and his success to be a warrior or a soldier. It never hinged upon Saul and his success to lead the army. It always hinged upon their submission to God. But I want you to read real quick. In verse 6 of chapter 13, we're going to read what the people of Israel, what their response was to encountering this great army of the Philistines. And it says in verse 6, "When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets, and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling." So I want you to think for a minute about the Israelites here, and think about their mindset now. They've been faced with these Philistines, they're coming, and their reaction, instead of turning to God, instead of looking at God and saying, "Lord, you've promised your protection, you've promised your hand of guidance, your hand of strength to fight for us," they fled. And look, even some of the words here are just really interesting, just to give you an idea of the Israelites' mindset. When it says they're in a strait in verse 6, it says that word strait means to be cramped, besieged. Imagine it's often used like in a strait betwixt two things, like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You're bound, you're limited, you're kind of constricted, and that's a place of fear and a place of trembling. It says they're distressed. And that word distressed I thought was really interesting, because if you look at the other times that's used in the Bible, it's translated in Exodus when the Israelites are under the hands of the Egyptians as taskmasters that were scourging, that were beating, that were pursuing. It's also translated in a lot of in the books of Chronicles as oppressor. So you have this idea of being distressed, that they're being oppressed, they're being pushed, they're being harassed. They're under this oppression, this tyranny. And the end of verse 7, it says trembling. And that literally just means trembling, to shake with fear, to quake, to shudder with terror. Is that mental image that's being drawn here of these Israelites now, the people of Israel, coming into this trial, coming into this difficult thing. And a few things happen. The first thing that happens is they come into this trial, they see it, and the first thing that happens is their eyes are pointed, instead of being pointed to God, their eyes turn, and now they're starting to look at their trial. They're starting to look at the Philistines' army. They're counting their horsemen. They're counting their chariots. They're seeing the soldiers without number that they can't even count because there's so many. And their eyes now, instead of looking at God, instead of looking at the God who promised that he would guide them, the God who promised that he would fight the battles for them, instead of calling to remembrance the stories of God knocking walls over without the children of Israel lifting a finger, instead of recalling stories of God parting the Red Sea and allowing the Israelites to pass through, instead of looking at God and instead of looking at him and saying, all right, God, I'm going to watch you fight this battle for us, they got their eyes so focused on this trial, so focused on the Philistine army, that they completely forgot the God that had promised to fight for them and forgot that God had promised to win that battle for them. And understand something, a lot of times in our life, you'll come into different things that are difficult. You'll come into trials, things that are stressful, things that are difficult. And our initial reaction a lot of times will be panic, fear, worrying. And I think it's even interesting to note that, I talked about this being Saul's second year of being a king, and the Philistines gathered this massive army to attack. And the fact that these things come, a lot of times they'll come out of the blue. They'll just show up, and all of a sudden you have something that's difficult, something that you have to work through, something that you don't maybe understand or know how to deal with or how to encounter. And it comes when you're not ready. You're not prepared. Saul hasn't had time to build up his kingdom. He hasn't had time to build up a strong military. None of his men even have swords, it says at the end of chapter 13. So now he's caught off guard. He doesn't have weapons. He doesn't have the military preparation. He's completely outclassed. He's facing something that he doesn't know how to fight, how to even defeat. He's been a king for 2 years. He doesn't have any experience being a general. He doesn't have any experience being a man of war. These are things that are completely out of his league and out of his element to deal with. And you see that what happens now is the more they focus on these problems, the more they focus on this trial, the less they're focused on God's promise and the less they're focused on God's commandment of protection. A really good story that I think illustrates this idea really well. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 14. This is probably a relatively familiar story to most of you about Peter and the disciples on the Sea of Galilee when a storm came through. And I'll go ahead and just read the passage real quick. It's Matthew 14. Go ahead and read in verse 29 or verse 28. So this is Peter and the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Christ has sent a storm. Christ is not on the boat. And it says, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come to thee on the water. And he said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when Jesus saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? So I want to kind of draw a comparison or a contrast, if you will, between this idea of trust or faith and doubt. And those two they're opposites. You can't have both faith or trust. Here, I've got a couple definitions here. Trust, this is from the Webster's 1828 dictionary. It says, trust means confidence, a reliance or resting of the mind on the integrity, veracity, justice, friendship, or other sound principle of another. And then the definition it has there for faith is belief, the assent of the mind to the truth of what is declared by another, resting on his authority and veracity without other evidence. So understand, in Matthew 14 here, the word that Jesus used is doubt. That you had something, you believed in something, you trusted in something, but now something else has come through and caused that faith, caused that trust, caused that belief to waver, to shake, to doubt. And what happened in Matthew 14 is the same thing that happened here in 1 Samuel 13 is the Israelites are trusting in God, they're believing in God, everything's great, but then something difficult comes up, and then something that is unexpected comes up, something that they can't control comes into play. And then all of a sudden that event, that circumstance, that happening that's going on that is now challenging their faith because it's out of their reach, it's out of their control, they can't in and of themselves do anything to stop it. And then all of a sudden it's a lot harder to have faith in God. It's a lot harder to trust in God because now I can't control what's going on. Now I can't keep my hand on this. I can't guide it where I want it to go. So by Peter turning his eyes on the waves, by the Israelites turning their eyes on the Philistines, their eyes are pulled away from God, and it becomes a distraction that causes them to have doubt in their life. And by focusing on the problem, by turning their eyes from God, that introduced doubt, and that doubt was doubt in God, doubt in his promises, doubt in his power, Because imagine, again, in the nation of Israel, if they had come to this event, they'd come to the Philistines are bringing an army, the Philistines are bringing just an innumerable men. If they had trust in God, if they had believed God, if they said, God, you've said you're going to protect us. You've said that one man of us will chase 1,000. You've said that you will fight for us. If they would have said, I believe you, God, I believe you, then they would have no reason to fear. They'd have no reason to flee into the high places. They'd have no reason to run from this scourge that's coming from the Philistines. But this, by turning their eyes away, introducing doubt to the power and promises of God, it's separating them from that power. It's separating them from belief. Faith, when you think about faith, when you think about belief, the entire chapter of Hebrews 11 talks about faith. It says, by faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Moses did this. By faith, and it goes through all these heroes of the Bible. It's oftentimes called the Hall of Faith, the Christian Hall of Faith. And those verses in Hebrews, it says, obviously the first verse, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, for by it the elders obtained a good report. I want you to think for a minute about what that faith means. What does it mean to have faith? It is that the faith is the empowerment of, God, I believe you, so I'm going to act on what you've told me. Right? It's that I believe what you've said. I am trusting you. I'm leaning on you. So I'm going to go where you tell me to go. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. I'm going to be obedient to you because I believe you. It says in verse 6 of chapter 11 of Hebrews, but without faith it is impossible to please him. That the Christian life, us living in the Christian life, it's impossible for us to do anything without faith. We must live and take every step by faith. It's what connects us to God. It's what binds us to God. It's what he uses to empower and strengthen us. It's us saying, Lord, I believe you. I trust in you. I'm going to lean on your promises. And so I'm going to rest in that. Even if the Philistine army is right here, even if there's 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and more men than I can count, even though it doesn't look like there's feasibly any way for you to guide me and lead me the way you want me, you say you will, I'm going to lean on you and trust in you regardless of that. Understand, you cannot have faith and doubt at the same time. There's a word, antithesis. They're opposites. They are mutually exclusive. You cannot say, Lord, I have faith in you. I believe you say what you say. I believe you're going to do what you say you will, but I'm going to hold on and I'm going to doubt it at the same time. You can't have both of those things at the same. You can't have faith and doubt. You cannot hold them in both hands. You can't try to sit on both sides of the fence. You have to pick one or the other. I'm going to keep reading Hebrews 11. It says in verse 33, this is right at the end after they've gone through the whole passage of Hebrews 11 talking about faith. It says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in light, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. It says, through faith, all of these things happened. All the chapter 11 was only accomplished by faith. Again, the nation of Israel, anytime they fought a battle, anytime they won a victory, was never because they had a stronger military. It was never because they had a better kingdom. It was always because they said, Lord, you've promised to protect us. You've promised to fight these battles for us. I'm going to believe what you've said. I'm going to do what you said and trust in you and lean on you. And faith was the empowering agent that allowed the nation of Israel to obey God. At the end of chapter 30, or verse 34 in Hebrews, again, it says, out of weakness we're made strong. Faith is what turned those that were weak and what enabled God to use them to do mighty things. You look at David and Goliath. You look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel. You look at all these stories throughout the Old and New Testament of God taking weak, broken people and using them mightily in a way that we couldn't even comprehend or fathom because they had faith and they believed God. And when we get our eyes off of God, when we start looking at the problem at hand, when we start looking at the things that we're dealing with instead of looking at our God, then a lot of times it's really easy for that faith to start to slip away and for us to doubt more and more because we see the problem. And the more you look at the problem, the more you realize how inadequate you are to deal with that problem. The more you focus on the Philistine army, the more you see their soldiers round about you, you see the chariots, you see the horsemen, the less you're thinking about God, the less you're thinking about God's promise of provision, God's promise of strength, because now you're so engrossed and so focused on all these Philistines that you're fleeing, you're trembling, you're in a strait, you're distressed, and the nation of Israel is now in that position of fear. So go ahead and keep reading in verse 9. We're going to be back in 1 Samuel 13. And I want you to notice something. Again, I said in the beginning, I'm going to compare and contrast Saul and David. And I want you to notice that Saul, during this time, this would have been a beautiful opportunity for Saul to use his position as king, to use his position as the newly established ruler of Israel, to now look at his nation, look at his people that are full of fear, they're full of trembling, they're full of uncertainty. And now Saul is the king. He's like, all right, what do I do now? He's at a point of, now what? My people are afraid, they're trembling, they're fearful. And says, verse 8, it says, and he tarried, this is talking about Saul, and he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Samuel had told Saul, I'm going to be there at a set time. I'm coming, and he's going to do the sacrifice. He's going to rally the people of Israel. He's going to bring the Spirit of God into the camp. And Saul said in verse 9, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. So Samuel's going to come. Samuel said, I'm going to be there. I'm going to offer the offering. And of course, if you read through the laws in the first 5 books of the Bible talking about who can offer sacrifices, who can make these burnt offerings before the Lord, there's very detailed instructions about who is allowed to, when they're allowed to, why they're allowed to. It's very well outlined and detailed. And Saul, as a king, that was not his position to be making this sacrifice. But he sees that Samuel's late. Samuel's not coming when he says he is. So Saul offers the sacrifice. And verse 10, it says, and it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul says, because I saw the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will now come down upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore, and offered a burnt offering. So understand now, Samuel said, I'm going to be there at a specific time. Don't offer the sacrifice till I get there, because that's Samuel's responsibility as the priest and the prophet of the nation of Israel. He's going to offer the sacrifices. And Saul, he waits, the time comes, and he sees the people, they're scattered. He sees the people, they're trembling. His people are in no shape to fight a battle that they are going to have to fight. And out of fear and out of worry and out of trembling, he offers the sacrifice. And I want you to understand that, think about Saul's mindset now. He's waiting for Samuel, and he's late. Samuel's late. Have you ever been in a position maybe where you feel like God didn't do something when you thought he should do something? That you had this expectation, Saul had this expectation of Samuel as the emissary of God. He said, you were supposed to be here. You were supposed to do something. You were supposed to fill a need that I had, and you didn't come through. You didn't fulfill that spot and fulfill that void that I expected you to do. This idea of Saul's expectations of Samuel, and even just expectations in general, it's an interesting topic, because a lot of times, that's my fiance Elizabeth, and we've talked a lot about in our life relationship and expectations of relationships, and we've had people give us advice about what you set your expectations are in a relationship. And a lot of times when you set your expectations on the wrong thing, you're setting yourself up to be disappointed, right? Saul's expectations here in this passage, his expectations were not set on a relationship with God. His eyes were not on God. Even just the way he describes this offering, it wasn't in Saul's mind, this offering wasn't a reconciliation or an offering of sweet smelling savor to God. It was something I can use to gather the people as something to patch my scattered army. He had these expectations of God. He had these expectations that God would do something, for him. And then he's like, God, you're not filling my expectations. So because you didn't meet my expectations, I don't trust you. And because I don't trust you, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, right? God had given him the guidance of what you're supposed to do with sacrifices. God had set forth his plan. God had set forth his guidance of the way Saul was supposed to run the kingdom, the way that the sacrifices were supposed to be done by the priests, the way all of these things were supposed to come into line. And now Saul's coming to a position where he's forced to make a choice. He's pinched, he's cramped, he's in a strait, and he says, okay, I can either wait and continue waiting for Samuel, and who knows when he's going to show up, or I can take matters into my own hands. I can take control of this myself, and I can make the plan. I can make it work in my own strength and in my own power, my own volition. And a lot of times that seems to be an easier choice for us as Christians. It's a lot easier instead of waiting for God to do what he said he would do. It's a lot easier for us to take control of a situation. It's a lot easier for us to grab the reins, to take control of it and make our own plans. An illustration that I think Brother Save's preached out here before, hasn't he? You guys know Brother Save. An illustration he uses, and he and I were talking about this maybe a year or two ago, was early on when I first met him, talking about the Christian life and talking about walking with God. And an illustration he uses is like a tandem bike, where you have two seats, one person steers, and the person on the back really doesn't have any control. They pedal, but they're just kind of along for the ride for the most part. And he compared that to the Christian life of us and Christ walking together. And either Christ is in the front and he's steering the tandem bike and we're following him, or we're in the front. But if I'm steering the bike, if I'm driving choosing where we're going and what we're doing, then Christ's not leading. And a lot of times as Christians, when we encounter something that we can't control, something that is outside of our element, something that's too difficult for us to grapple with, to deal with, a lot of times it's easier to try to take the reins and try to control and say, no, God, you get in the back. I'm gonna control this. I'm gonna steer. I'm gonna drive my life. And that's what we see Saul is doing here. He's coming to a point where God didn't meet his expectations. He's fearful. The people of Israel are scattered. And he says, Lord, I don't know what to do. I'm going to take control, get in the back of the bike. I'm driving now. And Saul makes this sacrifice. And I just want to bring to mind your ideas. Have you ever been in a position where you feel like God maybe has let you down, where you're in a position, you're like, Lord, I expected you to do something. I expected you to give me an answer by now. I expected you to guide me. And instead now I'm sitting here. You didn't meet my expectations. You didn't do what I expected you to do. And now I'm going to take control because you didn't come through for me, God. And just that mindset is a very selfish, it's a very self-centered mindset of our life. But it's so easy to get into a position like that. And a lot of times it's not something you would overtly say of like, Lord, I'm taking control, you're getting on the back of the bike. But sometimes it's so easy that we slip to the front of the bike, and before we know it, we're taking the reins of our life, we're steering where we're going, and we've pushed God to the back, and we've pushed him to the background. But this is what happened here with Saul's life, with Samuel coming and Samuel says, what hast thou done? And Saul is now confronted with this reality that he has usurped this position of authority that God had in his life. So I want you to read verse 13. It says, and Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God when he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. I want you to now to understand that this event that happened in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel was so significant that God saw fit to pull away Saul's kingdom. God saw fit to say, Saul, your kingdom's not going to continue after you. I'm picking somebody else that's a man after my own heart. Because, at first when I was reading through this, it felt like a bit of it felt almost like seemingly like a small thing for God to pronounce such a hefty judgment on Saul. But this is more than just Saul himself being disobedient to God. This is Saul taking an opportunity that God had given him to be a strength to the nation of Israel, to be a light to the nation of Israel, to rally the people of Israel and say, why are we afraid? To point them to God, to point them to the God that promised to protect them, the God that promised to fight for them. And instead of treating it as that opportunity, Saul became an example to the Israelites of a king that himself didn't trust God. And he tarnished the name and reputation of the Lord. And so because of that, God said, through Samuel, he said, I've chosen a man after my own heart. I've chosen a man who will be obedient to me, a man who will be faithful, a man who will trust me, and who will lead the nation of Israel accordingly. So I want to go ahead and look over, I said I was going to compare it to David. So go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel 17. And you'll see a story here. This is the story of David and Goliath. I want to just read through a few highlights. I'm not going to go through the whole story. But from the outset of the story, it plays out very similarly to 1 Samuel 13, in that you have Saul as king, you have the nation of Israel fighting the Philistines, and you have a battle that is seemingly impossible. You have a task or something that's encountering the nation of Israel, a trial that's beyond their control. And you see Goliath himself being something that the Israelites can't control, something that is causing the Israelites to fear, is causing them to tremble. In verse 16, it says that he's been rising up, and this is probably a familiar story. I'm not going to belabor all of the points to most of you. But you see that Goliath has been mocking the name of God for 40 days. He gets up, he mocks the name of God. The Israelites are afraid. They're hiding. They're, again, drawing a lot of these similarities and these parallels to chapter 13 of the nation of Israel encountering something that they can't control, encountering something that would rely them to wholly and completely throw themselves up before the mercy of God and completely rely on his strength to win a battle. And again, you see the nation of Israel, instead of turning to God, instead of trusting in him, they're cowering, they're frightful. And again, you see Saul, instead of leading the nation of Israel the way that God would have him lead them, he's cowering, they're hiding. And go ahead and look in we'll start in verse 28. And verse 29. And David said, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. So this is David. He's talking to Eliab. And Eliab basically says, "You're just coming up to see the battle. You're not coming up here to, you're just a dumb child. You're just young, foolish. You're just here because it's exciting and it's cool. You're here just to see the battle." And David says, "Is there not a cause?" And he turned from him and he's talking to all these people. And it says they're all answered him again after the former manner. They're all treating him the same way Eliab is. If you're just a young child, there's nothing you can do here. And when the words which were heard, which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul. This is verse 31. And he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And so we see David here. I want you to notice his mindset and his shift and the difference between David, who the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart, the difference between David and Saul, Saul coming to a point when he didn't understand what God was doing in chapter 13, when he came to that position of fear and trembling, his reaction was to take matters into his own hands and to take control of it and say, "Lord, I've got this. I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to make the sacrifice because I can't trust you." Comparing that with David and David's actions here in chapter 17, David says to Saul, "Don't worry, I'm going to go and fight the Philistine." And then he goes on, talks about his qualifications, having fought a lion and a bear. Verse 36, it says, "Thy servant slew both a lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God." Verse 45. I'm just going to skip ahead again. This is a familiar story. I'm not going to belabor the points. It says, "Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord God of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give thee the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God of Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So understand, I want you to, again, draw a comparison and a contrast between the way David goes into this battle with Goliath and the way that Saul led the nation of Israel in chapter 13. Instead of Saul, who was fearful, who didn't trust God, who took matters into his own hands and didn't believe what God had said when he commanded him, when he gave him the promise of protection, David looks at an event that is by all earthly measures impossible for him to win this battle. David's not a soldier. He's not trained in war. He doesn't have armor. He's got a sling. He has no weapons of war. He doesn't have a sword or a spear. He doesn't have a shield. He has a sling. And he's fighting a giant who's trained in war his whole life. But David says, not because he doesn't come up and say, "I'm a great slinger. I'm going to sling this so accurately and I kill you." He's going to say, "No, God is strong. The Lord is going to fight the battle for me. The Lord is going to defeat you, and the Lord will deliver you into my hand." David didn't come to the battle with a sense of pride and a sense in his own accomplishments. He said, "Because I know who I serve, because I know who my life is committed to, I have faith in God, and I have faith that God will defeat you because you've defied the armies of the living God. And I want you to understand that is what I believe is when God said he's looking for a man after his own heart. He's looking for a man he was looking for a man who is willing to have faith in God, who is willing to, despite what the circumstances around them were, despite all the people defying the armies of God, despite his brother and the armies saying, no, you can't do this. He was willing to stand up and say, no, I know what God has promised to us as a nation. I know what God has promised to me as an individual, and I'm going to trust and rely on God. And by faith, I'm going to obey him and do what he's commanded me to do because I believe in God. And I believe that's the core difference between Saul and between David. Between Saul as a king who, when faced with a trial and faced with something he couldn't control and he couldn't put his hands on, instead of trusting in God, he took the reins of his life. He took the control of the sacrifice and said, I'm gonna make the sacrifice because I don't trust God, because I don't think God's gonna come through like he said he would. Instead of being like that, instead of being like Saul, David said, no, I trust in God. I believe what you've said. So because I believe in what you've said, I'm going to obey you. In the way we live our lives, in the way I mentioned earlier that the only way to live the Christian life is by faith. If it's not I think there's a verse, I should have written it down. I remember thinking about when I was studying yesterday. I think it's whatsoever is not of faith is of sin, if I believe is the quote. I'm probably misquoting it. But as a Christian, when we're going through our life, when we're encountering difficulties, when we're encountering trials, it's almost a given that in living the Christian life, we're going to come across things that we don't understand, that we can't control, and that we can't plan, it's going to come unexpectedly. Difficult things are going to happen. And as a Christian, we're going to have to choose in our life how we interact with that. And we can make a choice to either take matters into our own hands, to be fearful, to be afraid, and try to control our life selfishly, or we can choose to let go, to let God, again, let the Holy Spirit lead and drive the tandem bike, if you will, in that analogy. We can choose to either let go, or we can choose to grab on. And that's really the only two choices. You can't, again, I talked earlier about, you can't hold on to both. You can't try so desperately to hold on to the reins while also saying, Lord, I have faith in you, I believe you, while you're holding on to the sacrifice, while you're offering the sacrifice like Saul. You have to make a choice between either letting go of the sacrifice or serving yourself. And those are the only two options. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you again for this truth that you've taught me about the Christian life, about having faith in you, about